Hi, everybody. Classic me, drop something before I even start. We'll get started. Start as you want to go on, so mistake on the first one, that's all good. Setting requirements. 안녕하세요. That's all the Korean I know, despite having lived here before, so I'll get that out of the way, sorry. Welcome to this session. The purpose of this session really is to talk about how do we reframe the discussion around military AI in two ways. The first is we've looked at what's happening with the GGE and with the sort of global effort to date, and how do we move to a position where we can identify some technical, some normative, some ethical standards that the majority of participants can agree on so we can get some movement? And what are the sort of I don't want to say low-hanging fruit because it's certainly not easy, but what are some of the concrete steps that we can take towards a bedrock we can start building best practice off of? And the second is really to sort of test an approach and a supposition, which is that moving to a regional level for these discussions, whether that is, a regional minilateral organization specifically for AI, whether it's a technical standards organization, whether it's under the auspices of something like the East Asia Summit or ASEAN or the African Union, is that an effective way of getting around some of the deadlock that we've seen at the global level? And so really sort of attacking that assumption, which I'll put my hand up and say that's my assumption. Having worked on regional issues, I think that, this is an effective path towards incremental improvement in this space. But that's one of the things I'm hoping to sort of inject in discussion with this. And I know that people will have opinions. So states have got diverging views on key aspects of AI and autonomous systems. And we've seen this with the GGE. And so, for example, while the majority of states will agree on things like we need responsible AI, we need safe AI, we need trustworthy AI, we need meaningful human control, when you drill down into what those mean, but more importantly, what the standards are, what the outcomes are around them, we see less agreement. And so the problem with that is the technology is continuing apace. We reach the potential in the near future of these systems beginning to proliferate without meaningful standards and approaches and common agreement on how we do things like de-escalation, how we do things like communication, and what the expectations are around each other's autonomous systems and AI. So our goal around this is to generate discussion around what are the sort of common language, common standards, common benchmarks that we could do in the short to medium term, and does this work at sort of a minilateral level? And whether that minilateral is bound together by geographic factors, geopolitical factors, or ethical standards is up for debate. So to help unpack that, we've got a great panel assembled here. We've got represented here a range of disciplines and experiences. We've got James Black, who's the Associate Director at RAND Europe. James does a lot of work around defence, AI, space, and has provided recommendations and research for a range of governments in Europe and the UK, as well as the Australian government and the US government. We've got Needy, my colleague from RAND US. Needy is an information scientist, a computer scientist by training. She works at the intersection of technology and policy on AI and defence AI, and particularly on workforce issues. We've got VS, who's been happy to join. We're happy to have him join us. VS is a leading cybersecurity and counterterrorism expert. He's currently the Walter P. Murphy Professor of Computer Science at Northwestern University. And then finally, we've got the fellow Australian on the panel, Dr. Kate Conroy, who is far more versed in the ethics and the law than I think most people I've met. Kate is a leading technology ethicist with roles with Australian government universities, QUT, UQ, but also with the government. She's appearing in her personal capacity. I will say on that as well that, everyone is representing their own views and not those of the organisation or any governments that we've done research with. However, I'm conscious that while there's a range of perspectives here, it's not actually representative of the whole range of regional perspectives. And so as a result, what we're planning to do is at the end, we're going to do an interactive Q&A. And what that looks like is we'll have this empty chair here. And when we get to the Q&A session at the end, you have an option. When you raise your hand to make a question or to make a comment, you can either just ask it normally, or you can come up here, ask it, and have a bit of a discussion with the panel around your perspective, the question, maybe take a question to an audience yourself, and then we'll swap that person around. This is the first time I've done something like this, so I encourage you to approach it in the spirit of the conference and move fast and break things, and hopefully not anything technical, or the engineers in the back will tell me off. But yes. So to kick off, however, we're fortunate to have Dr. Abby Fanlow, who is the Policy and Strategy Lead for the US Department of Defense Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Office. Dr. Fanlow is an experienced policy researcher with a PhD from Stanford and has agreed to open our panel with some points on the US approach and responsible AI more generally. I'll hand over to Abby. Gary, can you do the Zoom? Here we are.
Hi, thanks so much, Austin. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I am Abby Fanlow. I am the Responsible AI Policy and Strategy Lead at the U.S. Department of Defense. I want to thank the organizers for making it possible for me to join virtually. I didn't want to interrupt the flow of the panel too much by hopping in via Zoom, so I think it works out for me to do an opening. This is a session on building consensus definitions and benchmarks for military AI, and we're all at, or you are all at, I'm just coming in virtually, the Responsible AI in the Military Domain Summit. So in this opening, I wanted to talk about how we have defined responsible AI at the United States Department of Defense, and how we have worked to create a shared understanding of responsible AI best practices, metrics, tools across the very large and very diverse enterprise that is the US Department of Defense, which has more than 40 separate component organizations, which I thought would perhaps be interesting as we then go into the panel that talks about how to do this on a slightly larger level on the regional scale, but still with that sort of diverse set of different actors. So the United States Department of Defense defines responsible AI as a dynamic approach to the design, development, deployment, and use of artificial intelligence systems, which implements the DoD AI ethical principles to advance the trustworthiness of those AI systems. But what are the DoD AI ethical principles, and how did we arrive at them as the Department of Defense? So in 2020, the US Department of Defense became the world's first military to adopt AI ethical principles, and we adopted 5. And I'm going to go through what those 5 principles are, those sort of conceptual definitions. So the first is responsible, which is a commitment that DoD personnel will exercise appropriate levels of judgment and care while remaining responsible for the development, deployment, and use of AI capabilities. It's really about ensuring that our personnel are taking a responsible approach to the entire AI lifecycle. The second is equitable, and this is a commitment to minimizing unintended bias in AI capabilities. The third is traceable, and this is a commitment that our AI capabilities will be developed and deployed in a manner such that our personnel possess an appropriate understanding of the technology itself, but also the actual processes of developing that technology via things like transparent and auditable methodologies, data sources, and design documentation. The fourth principle is reliable, and this is a commitment to making our AI capabilities or ensuring that our AI capabilities have very clear and well-defined use cases, and that the safety, security, and effectiveness of those capabilities is subject to rigorous testing and assurance within those defined use cases across their entire life cycle. And the final principle is governable. And this is a commitment to designing and engineering AI capabilities to fulfill intended functions, but also making sure that those capabilities have the ability to detect and avoid unintended consequences, and that it's possible to disengage or deactivate deployed systems depending on the likelihood of that unintended behavior or the actual demonstration of unintended behavior. So those are our 5 AI ethical principles. They were developed through a multi-stakeholder process led by our Defense Innovation Board. And that process involved talking to leading AI experts in commercial industry, government, academia, and the American public, and then resulting in a pretty rigorous process of analysis of all of that feedback that we received and making sure there were a lot of opportunities for public input and comment. And overall, those conversations, that multi-stakeholder process was really focused on how do you take our nation's high-level values and translate them into the context of AI. And they ended up with those 5 principles that I just laid out. So now you all have heard that the DoD defines responsible AI as an approach to the AI lifecycle that implements specific ethical principles. And I've gone through what those principles are and how the DoD arrived at them. But what does it actually mean to design, develop, deploy, and use AI in a manner that implements ethical principles? And I think that's a question that this whole panel is trying to sort of get at. And that is the work of my team at DoD and all of our partners across the DoD enterprise. Responsible AI work at the US Department of Defense is really about translating our DoD AI ethical principles into concrete actions, concrete processes, concrete benchmarks to fit different AI use cases. And that really means that responsible AI work requires developing resources and writing policy guidance, but it also means building consensus around those resources by coordinating them across the entire enterprise. And in practice, that involves several different things that I'm going to touch on. Number one, we focus on developing technical tools and best practice guides for DoD personnel to enable them to assess and to ensure that an AI system is aligned with our DoD AI ethical principles. And those tools and best practices that allow them to do that include everything from risk and impact assessments to out of distribution detection tools, to red teaming guides, to test and evaluation toolkits focused on natural robustness or adversarial robustness, and so on. And at DoD, we've consolidated kind of all of those technical tools and best practices into our DoD Responsible AI Toolkit, which provides kind of 2 main things. First, a centralized risk assessment process through which AI projects can identify, track, and improve alignment with the DoD AI ethical principles, and overall manage risks while still capitalizing on opportunities for innovation. The toolkit also includes a list of 70+ open source technical tools that help DoD personnel identify and mitigate risks in an AI system. And the risk assessment actually routes people to tools that help them answer the questions in that risk assessment. There was a separate breakout session on the DoD RAI toolkit at REAIM, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I do want to emphasize that this is a resource that folks across the DoD can use to ensure they're on the right page in terms of how to assess and to ensure that an AI system is aligned with those AI ethical principles. And because this is a session on building consensus and sort of how do we arrive at these best practices and metrics and benchmarks, I want to touch on how we actually developed the toolkit. And we did it through both a top-down and a bottom-up approach. So from the top down, we identified classes of tools that would be necessary to assess and to assure alignment with those ethical principles. So what's actually necessary to assess whether we're minimizing unintended bias, or what's necessary to make sure we have the right types of documentation of data sources, for example. But from the bottom up, we also did a lot of market research and academic literature reviews to identify the responsible AI best practices that exist out there right now, including things like the US National Institute of Standards and Technology AI Risk Management Framework, IEEE 7000, and so on. And then once we actually released the toolkit, we did, and we are continuing to do a lot of validation work across the DoD to get feedback from mission partners on how that process and how those tools actually work in practice. So hopefully that gives a sense of how we've approached building and iterating on kind of best practice guides and technical tools for responsible AI at the Department of Defense, and how we crowdsourced a lot of that information from experts across academia, industry, and the DoD itself. So that's sort of one part of responsible AI work. The next part is developing policy guidance to help DoD components, those 40 plus different organizations, actually oversee the responsible implementation of AI capabilities within their organizations. So for example, we recently issued guidance to DoD components on the specific risks associated with generative AI that components need to address in governance processes, including training data quality, cyber and adversarial resilience, traceability of Gen AI systems, threats to effective human-machine teaming, and socio-technical risks like addressing bias and toxicity. And the purpose of this guidance was to, again, get everyone at DoD across the various components on the same page about the specific risks associated with generative AI that they needed to assess, to identify, and to proactively address when individuals in those components were developing, acquiring, deploying, or using generative AI capabilities. And we developed that guidance by creating interdisciplinary research groups consisting of DoD personnel, federally funded research and development centers, university-affiliated research center experts, and other DoD personnel with subject matter expertise on each subject. And all of that work culminated in a technical report on generative AI risks and mitigations, which we then translated into the specific policy guidance. So that's just sort of one example of the policy work we are doing, but hopefully it illustrates the approach we're taking to how we figure out what responsible AI work really requires and entails. In addition to building technical tools and best practice guides and policy guidance, RAI work requires building really close relationships and regularly coordinating with component level AI and responsible AI leads across a very large enterprise. And for us, that means really working closely with individuals who oversee AI work within the military departments or the joint staff or defense field agencies and so on. And we regularly meet with those individuals as well as convene them together on a regular basis. And that enables us to do a number of things. Number one, it allows us to keep them updated on the concrete actions, processes, metrics, benchmarks, and policies that our office is creating, but also enables us to get feedback on those things from the perspective of people that will have to implement those things within their organizations. And it allows the AI leaders to connect us with program managers and developers who are actually building and acquiring AI systems, so we can get feedback from them to make sure that the resources we're providing are actually impactful and feasible to implement. It also allows us to really share best practices and lessons learned across the department and up-level all of us in our understanding of responsible AI concepts. So we think that kind of building relationships and regularly getting feedback on these kinds of metrics and resources and processes from people across the entire DoD is really essential for building consensus around the RAI resources that we are putting out as the Department of Defense RAI division. And then lastly, another big part of our work is collaborating with our international military partners on AI assurance processes and really sharing lessons learned in the responsible AI space. So we regularly work, for example, with our partners in NATO on responsible AI topics and have co-developed responsible AI resources for use across the NATO enterprise. We're also actively engaged in collaborations with many other international partners outside of NATO. And this kind of ongoing collaboration and information sharing on responsible AI promotes shared approaches to AI assurance that we think are really critical for interoperability. And at DoD, we've put all of that work I just touched on, building technical tools and best practice guides, publishing policy guidance, convening AI and RAI leads from across DoD, and working with international military partners into a cross-department strategy, which is our DoD responsible AI strategy and implementation pathway. And that process of developing that document was really, again, crowdsourcing responsible AI needs from across the department, coordinating the tasks that we felt were most important for meeting those needs, and then getting sign-off and buy-in from people across the department and eventually from the Deputy Secretary of Defense. And that was really an important effort in building consensus around the right approach to responsible AI, really building consensus on the overall strategy. The last thing I want to touch on is that in addition to building consensus around what responsible AI is and consensus around the RAI resources that we use to implement responsible AI best practices, we also believe it's really important to define and build consensus around the value of responsible AI within military organizations to build support across the DoD enterprise for this kind of work. So I want to touch on how we've defined the value of responsible AI to the Department of Defense. Number one, we've really emphasized that responsible AI removes barriers to innovation and adoption through risk identification and reduction. So if you're a developer or an innovator, and you know that there are certain system safety and reliability metrics that you have to meet and ethical and legal obligations that your system needs to align with, you might be overwhelmed with how to meet those expectations and requirements. But responsible AI work is really providing clear processes and metrics and tools that as a developer or an innovator, you can rely on to ensure a system is aligned with those expectations and requirements. And when you have access to that information, that sort of clearly laid out process, those clearly laid out metrics you need to meet, you don't have to figure out how to align a system with those principles or expectations yourself. And that really reduces the cognitive load on innovators and allows them to focus on really developing AI systems rather than figuring out how to do compliance. Also, if you're an end user of an AI system, responsible AI work provides assurance that the technology has been developed to reduce risks of failure, unintended consequences, and dangerous or difficult ethical situations and choices for operational users. And so basically, in other words, responsible AI work enables end users to trust that the AI system is going to operate as promised and isn't going to introduce moral, ethical issues for the user. And we know from a lot of research in the system safety world that people don't want to adopt technology that they don't trust. So in this way, responsible AI contributes to adoption of cutting edge technology. Responsible AI also contributes to mission success by increasing assurance, and it does so in a number of ways. It provides assurance to industry partners that the United States DoD will responsibly store their technologies. Two, it provides assurance to the American public that AI-enabled capabilities employed by the DoD are aligned with our nation's values. And number three, it provides assurance for allies that our systems, tools, and processes are grounded in shared values, which can really help contribute to interoperability. And so as we talk about responsible AI, we really try to emphasize that value proposition to build consensus around the importance of participating in this work across the entire DoD and the importance of paying attention to the concrete processes and metrics and benchmarks that we're asking people to implement as they develop and deploy these technologies. So hopefully that provides an overview of how we've approached defining responsible AI at the DoD and building resources to actually implement responsible AI best practices that have buy-in from across the entire department. So thanks so much to the organizers for having me open the session, and I'll pass it back now to move forward with questions for the panel.
Thanks very much, Abby. Appreciate it. I think it's especially important to look at the combination of bottom up and top down and multi-stakeholder engagement when we're designing these systems. There's a variety of sort of theories that support that. Value-sensitive design comes to mind. We're now going to move to VS, who's going to present a series of scenarios, and these are designed to provoke discussion and try and get at some of those grey areas and fuzzy areas. Here you go.
Thank you, Austin. All right. So my job today is to be provocative. And if there's no controversy, there's no need to worry about having consensus, and everything would be easy. So I'm going to be talking about 3 scenarios. One dealing with loitering ammunitions, one dealing with deepfakes, and one dealing with leveraging AI to destabilize terrorist networks. All of these are real-world systems that, some of us, in some cases my lab, some places elsewhere, have developed. I'm putting up a very, very simple picture here on the left, all right? And I'm going to invite people to tell me which node to take out if you want to destabilize a network consisting of just this half a dozen nodes that you see there. Think of each of those nodes as a person. All right. So, it's a trick question, of course. And the answer is, it depends. And let me explain what it depends on in a few minutes. And even if you were right, Stuart, thank you. And I gave you a more complex network. And, this is hardly the size of a, oops, sorry, I hope I'm not.
Oh, you know what, I want to watch your slides, so I'm going to.
This is hardly a large terrorist network here. It's a very small network. But we as humans, when we look at it, have difficulty figuring out who to take out of that network if, say, you have to take out one person or 2. So again, take a look. It's not easy. And the reason I said the answer is it depends is that when you look at a network and you're going to provoke that network by doing something to it, you have to think about the fact that this network is going to push back, especially in the case of a terrorist network. They're not going to sit tight. And that's where AI comes in and plays a role. There are many places it plays a role, but when we look at a network, a terrorist network, the word destabilize can be defined in many ways, all right? And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how we might think about defining destabilization of a terrorist network. One way is to think about minimizing the lethality of the network after whatever destabilization operation you're going to conduct. All right, that may be a capture operation, for example. Another might be to say, well, targeting this network, the goal is to achieve justice for the victims of the attacks, presumably that the network has carried out previously. That's a different objective. And you can imagine many other objectives, okay? But should it be to provide justice for the terrorists? I mean, how many of you think that's a fair thing to sort of shoot for? All right, I'm glad I asked that question because it shows there's some consensus here. But where does the AI come in? When you take out a terrorist, you've got to do this pretty darn carefully. You've got to understand the consequences of taking that person out, all right? Doesn't matter if it's the head of a group or somebody, in senior management of the group, or somebody lower down the totem pole. You've got to be able to understand how the cascading effects of removing one person from the network might affect the rest of the network. So imagine the CEO of a company leaving, that person is replaced by somebody else, who in turn might be replaced by somebody else. Some people may come from inside the company, some people may come from outside the company, some may move laterally, some may move upwards. We've got to think about that. We got to understand how the new shape of this network, the context in which it lives, the environment in which it operates is going to affect its lethality. And for that, you need models of lethality that are capable of predicting the lethalities of these networks that you've never seen before. So can you learn models of that? So we can do all these things. But the fact of the matter is that regardless of which of these societal goals or national goals I've listed here, as well as many others that exist, the important point I want to emphasize is that the answer to these questions differs from one country to another. Every country has its own national goals, it has its own culture, it has its own religion, it has its own practices, and that is something that we should respect, all right? So the definition of ethics really is, we can agree on some aspects of it, but we have to be sensitive to the fact that ethics in country A may not be the same as ethics in country B. And when we think about this, whose definition of ethics is a really interesting question that we should grapple with. And that goes to the issue of trying to build consensus. There's going to be some amount of consensus that can probably be built, but we have to leave room for difference. Second scenario is the role of deepfakes. How many of you think deepfakes are bad? All right. A few hands are going up tentatively. Okay, great. So we've seen lots of headlines like this, but again, the provocative aspect of my talk is that deepfakes are not necessarily all bad, all right? And these are some, little pieces of multimodal content, a text, text at the bottom, which looks like a tweet with emojis and cute pictures, a real picture of a piece of content. And what we are trying to do here is to generate multimodal content that is as engaging as possible. As engaging as possible means, the probability that somebody is going to click on it should be high. And if possible, it can be targeted. So that's great for a lot of applications. Advertisers would be really, really happy with that. Some of you may object to advertisers having such information, but I think it's hard to dismiss that as irresponsible AI, all right? However, now put yourself, and likewise, imagine a healthcare app which is deploying technology like this because it knows that to convince Kate to do something which is health beneficial to her, they've got to present things to her in a way that appeals to her and makes it visually compelling. But the same technology that induces somebody to click on something is also something that I can leverage if I'm a malicious hacker who targets you with a message which looks very attractive through a tweet or a post directed at you, okay, and targeted at you. So these are all very, we heard the word dual use in one of the plenary sessions this morning, and this is something that I really want to highlight. A couple of years back, we built a system which tried to destabilize terrorist networks by inducing dissension between members of the group, all right? We know in the case of some terrorist groups that as long as there's internal dissension, they don't carry out attacks. I can specifically mention those groups if you like, but there may be others. So is there something fundamentally wrong with using deepfakes to put words in the mouth of a terrorist, for example, criticizing another terrorist in his group with the intent of inducing dissension amongst them? I would argue that that's at least a questionable or debatable proposition. And again, different countries might arrive at different answers to that question. And I personally would find that not surprising and not necessarily unethical on the part of the countries involved, even if they arrive at different answers to the same question. The reason, of course, is countries have very, very different security situations. They're sensitive to different things. We need to think about that. And just to give you an example, this is a video we produced a few years back. I'm going to try and play it and see if it works. All right, you can't hear him. That is Anwar al-Awlaki. By the way, for those academics in the room, I don't need an IRB to deal with dead people. So it's clean work. And so I'm free to put words in his mouth as long as I disclose it's a deep fake, all right? So I'm sorry the audio didn't play here, but we were having him say something which he never said and speaking a language which he did not speak, yeah. So again, the point I'm making, different countries can think differently about different scenarios. They can use different definitions of what is ethical, what's not. And part of the job of consensus is figuring out what the common elements are across the board that apply and trying to leverage those commonalities into some kind of agreement on a regional or broader basis. The third scenario we look at is a hypothetical scenario where imagine a nation state A, which is frequently involved in incursions of maritime boundaries into the domain of nation state B, where they attack civilian vessels and shipping in nation state B. Just a hypothetical situation. And imagine over the years that several innocent citizens of nation B have died in these attacks, all right? Nation B can respond in many ways. So one response might be that after a certain amount of time, nation B decides to create a fleet of mini drones, or they could be larger drones. But generally speaking, I like mini because, you know, can you all remember which animal kills more people in the world every year?
Mosquitoes.
Exactly. Mosquitoes, you know, small is deadly, all right? And we're seeing that in the case of the current conflict in Ukraine. So one example, a reactive example, is they create this mini drone fleet consisting of ASVs, AUVs, and they inform Nation A that they will take out the offending vessels in the future. Perhaps they have a show of the capabilities of their fleet and use this as a way of signaling the opponent A in this case. And the idea is that the next time the same offensive action is taken by the state A in the waters of B, they take some action involving their AUVs, all right? Exactly what that action is can vary. It could be actually a kinetic explosive action. It could be a targeting action, which involves systems locking onto the target and so forth. So I think this is almost my last slide. The second option is that they are proactive and they say, what the heck, you know, these guys have done this to us over and over again. We're gonna send a fleet out into international waters, just across the territorial boundaries, and take care of this. The third option is to be inert and just take it, all right? Again, these are scenarios where different nations these are just three possible ways. There are many other possible responses. They could include economic responses. They could include cocktails of kinetic and economic responses. We're not saying any of these is right or wrong. We're saying these are a menu of options, and there are lots of things that countries may decide to do in response to these kinds of actions. These are just three examples. And some of them are, you know, perhaps you might say pushing the boundaries of what nations may want to do, but I want to show the spectrum of options. So again, countries involved may look at this in different ways. So again, to achieve consensus, you have to understand what it is that is separating agreement, right? Because those are the obstacles that need to be overcome. Countries have very different religions, very different security perspectives, very different cultural practices, very different political systems. Respect is something that's necessary to negotiate. And you cannot negotiate without respect for your adversary or the negotiating party. And so a global agreement on responsible use of AI in the military is going to have to bring a lot of countries to the table, you know? And I don't know about all of you, but in my faculty meetings, I have difficulty getting consensus amongst 40 or 50 faculty members who are independent people. They don't have political systems behind them. Try that with 100 to 200 governments, all of which have multiple political parties, multiple stakeholders to satisfy. This problem becomes really, really hard. So I want to conclude by saying, you know, maybe thinking smaller is actually thinking bigger. Can we achieve small agreements, either regionally or cross groupings of countries, perhaps not in the same geographic region, but that think alike, and get small agreements in place, and then build on those small steps to build broader agreements between one block of countries and another block of countries. Block A is agreed on some principles of responsible AI. Block B is agreed on perhaps slightly different principles. Can we then bring them together in a second stage? Thank you very much.
Thanks, VS. And I think, you know, when I say, can you be controversial? It's always helpful when all three other panelists are like rapidly writing notes. It's always a good sign for that. Thank you. I think one of the things is I'm a policy person, not a technical person, but I think a lot of these discussions, we often need a technical basis for what we're talking about. It's always good to come back to what's achievable in terms of what can we measure, what can we objectively prove to an adversary in the computer science space. So I'll hand over to Neeti now, who's going to talk about, you know, what are the technical areas where we can collaborate on, you know, where are some of the barriers there? Thank you.
Yeah. So I think this is on. Okay. So I will, piggyback from where VS left. He discussed that there are these inherent differences in the definitions. I want to focus on some of these standard building capabilities, and I want to focus on this risk-informed, consensus-based, how to build these types of standards. This is based on some of my past work and some of the work that is informed by the NIST, the US government agency on standards. So, developing this standard ecosystem is very important. It guides policymakers and regulators on how to implement high-level principles and policies. But I want to highlight 3 things that are needed when we think about developing these AI standards, either globally or regionally. First is that these they have to be based on a solid scientific evidence. If you're, these standards are, the more grounded they are on scientific evidence, the more amenable they will be, for adoption. So first is, grounding in scientific, in science and theory. Second is we can think about, aligning these, think about these standards as sectoral and cross-sectoral. Sectoral could be, for example, AI standards in healthcare or AI for autonomous vehicles. But there, at the same time, there are cross-sectoral, which focuses on developing AI standards that could be used across these different, sectors, so we can learn, leverage understanding from each other. And third thing is that obviously these standards have to be driven by consensus. They have to be open, transparent. The difficult thing with a lot of AI is that it is these are black boxed box methods, and the last thing we want is building regulation and policy that is not transparent. So they should not be solely driven by industry. When we think about AI in military settings, we should focus on focus on outcomes or capabilities, rather than providing prescriptions on how this should happen, because we all talk about that the technology is rapidly evolving. So the consensus should focus on what type of capabilities. Obviously, they have to be human and value centered. What type of values do we want to encode in these systems during, in the battlefield or during these high conflict times? And then obviously they have to be ethically aligned. So this, some of the, and as we go about with this dialogue, we have to think about these risk steps, identifying these different risks, managing, mitigating the risks, prioritizing the risks, what are our risk tolerance. So, coming to it, and then we have to develop these standards in a timely manner. So, once we have some kind of, we can always prioritize these standards, where there is solid grounding, and standards need to be built in, near future. And then, maybe there are certain aspects where there is not much scientific, grounding, and so it will take time to build these the standards. Yeah, I will stop here, and so just some of these thoughts.
Great, thanks, Nidhi. I think it's important that we do think about risks and we keep a technical grounding. I think everyone in this room has been to conferences and also had conversations with policymakers, and sometimes part of that discussion before we can get to the meat and potatoes of this is around, okay, this is where the technology is actually at. Don't overemphasize, don't underemphasize it. This is where we can have a discussion. We're now going to move on to Kate, who's graciously volunteered to do the trickiest bit, which is how you do ethical standards in this space. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Austin, and thanks so much to my previous speakers for setting such a great grounding for the discussion. So I guess I want to do 3 things. Why is it hard? Should we try anyway? But what if we don't? So why is this hard? Why is this hard? The UN CCWGGE has been going for a very long time. Kirsten Vineyard spoke yesterday in a plenary about the cyber negotiations that went for 20+ years with no sort of resolution in terms of really concretizing action. And this morning's plenary said, well, why don't we apply the framework around the ozone layer mitigation to the problem of AI? And I just don't know if that's going to work. But why? Why is this so hard? And not like nuclear or landmines or blinding lasers, right? Well, one of the reasons why it's hard is, I'm going to use a taxonomy from philosophy because I'm a philosopher. So philosophy is really conducts itself around three major lines of effort. Metaphysics, what there is. Epistemology, how do we know what there is? And ethics. So what should we do given that we know what exists? Well, metaphysically, when we think about AI and autonomous weapons and other sorts of things, we get really caught up in a lot of definitional debate and confusion and articulations and disagreements. And in philosophy, in metaphysics, there are metaphysically vague concepts. For example, like where does a cloud begin and end, right? How many atoms of a cloud, how many molecules of water do you need to take from a cloud for the cloud to be the same cloud? How many hairs do you need on a man's head for him to be bald or not bald? And you can use logic systems like para-consistent logic in order to try and deal with vagueness in logical ways. You know, Wittgenstein tried to define a game by understanding that maybe we need a plurality of okay ways to define a game, and that game isn't just a competition. A game can be more like a kind of dance, right? It doesn't have to be between two people or more people. It could be just one person playing a game. So defining a game is really hard. And in biology, the biologists have struggled with a species definition. What is a species? Oh, well, it could be interbreeding populations. That's why donkeys can be a species, but a mule can't, because mules can't produce fertile offspring. But amoeba doesn't need to sexually reproduce, but amoebas seem to be a species. Some species were defined in Darwinian terms by morphological characteristics, and there were type species that were defined on what they look like. Like finches had colors and shapes, and that's how we're going to define them. So species is a really varied word. And so species pluralism is one way that biologists try to be able to speak meaningfully about categories without needing necessarily to fall on a singular definition. So metaphysical ambiguity is probably one of the things that beleaguers the AI space a huge deal and has caused so much trouble in trying to achieve a consensus. And of course, if you can't get your metaphysics right, it's going to be really hard to solve the epistemic question, just how do we know? Because if you don't know what it is we're referring to, then knowing what we need to go after is really, really challenging. And while we do have toolkits, which is fantastic, we don't yet have really good metrics. We don't really have very good tests yet. We don't know what it is that we're testing for, that we can then be confident in the capabilities when we develop them. The normative level, which is what should we do, actually has kind of been a bit easier, right? So this is like a meta-ethical part of this endeavor. The meta-ethical part is, well, what is good, right? What is good AI? And that's where we've had some of these high principle-based approaches. And the good thing about principle-based approaches is that allows people to come together at a certain point in the conceptual structure, but then in the operationalization of the instantiation of that structure, you can have a lot of diversity, right? So should we try anyway? Well, I think we've tried a lot and we've made a huge amount of progress. So I feel frustration when we come to REAIM the second time and we don't, grasp all of the amazing work we've done to date and say, we've actually made some progress. I think we've made a huge amount of progress in ethical AI. There are a lot of commonalities between diverse actors in terms of thinking of what's important at that meta-ethical level. These high-level principles, there is a lot of consensus around them, and we have hundreds of ethical frameworks, but actually there's a lot of commonality. And the use of the word responsibility as a primary category really came from a consensus from all these different ethical frameworks that probably we can all come around on responsibility. And I think the Edinburgh Declaration on Responsibility for Responsible AI is a really good breakout of what responsibility is into causal responsibility, legal responsibility, moral responsibility, role responsibility, and virtue responsibility. Look up Edinburgh Declaration if you want to find out more about this. Very well put together, because responsibility is one of these higher order categories that we can unite around. And I think, yes, we should try, and we have tried, and we should continue to work and collaborate. But what if we don't? In the sense of, what if we don't worry about having to find consensus for us to achieve the impact that we want? So I think there's a lot of progress we can make if we don't obsessively feel that unless we have agreement, we can't progress. And certainly with the cyber negotiations, Russia was really, really focused on trying to get definitional agreement around cyber. And there was so much diversity that didn't go anywhere. And as we know, there hasn't been like a UN level agreement around cyber to constrain it. And I think a lot of the challenges in AI, particularly the epistemic challenges, the black box issue, the issue around how do we open up a drone and know whether that cargo drone, fleeing in Libya, was actually autonomously, driving itself in a way that was unacceptable to our ethical codes. Well, when you open up the hardware, you can't see what the programming is. So these epistemic problems are huge. And so is there a point of creating structures that can't be then verified for there to be consequences for those systems? What are some advantages of not having consensus, right? So I'm going to draw on things like the importance of some high-level values, autonomy, justice, and well-being, and sovereignty. So there's consensus, which is dominance and a kind of one view to rule them all, which empowers those who are best able and wealthy enough to implement it. So if you're wealthy enough as a nation and you're powerful enough as a nation, if you have a lot of complicated governance and then you tell the rest of the world that's the governance you need in order to be ethical, you're pretty much saying you can't be ethical if you're not rich, you can't be ethical if you're not powerful, because you can't comply with these extremely complicated obligations. So there is a real worry about the way we set up our frameworks, that we actually deny sovereignty of a respectful kind, because I think respect is a really important word. And I think some of the leadership in Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance, prioritising governance for groups and for allowing that diversity and that autonomy and sovereignty of decision-making amongst groups, is a really good framework that we can take to respect difference in the implementation of our values. And that perhaps rather than consensus, what we should really be working on is understanding, and using common standards and principles where they are assistive in the way that we interact with each other. But I think we can progress the really good work to date and take all of this good stuff and justify what we do in our behaviours, because at the end of the day, there's so much ambiguity in our actions. There's so much ability for us to disagree with what is right in a particular context, particularly in military actions. That accountability and responsibility, where you have to justify what you do and be answerable to your stakeholders, is the thing which binds us all. And the justifications we all provide may differ, and then we'll all have to evaluate our responses in our own value-centered way. So thank you.
Thanks, Kate. I should really run all my remarks past Kate before I say them, because it is around, is consensus at a global level really something we should be pushing for? Is it more about respect and group-based approaches, which is a little more eloquent than I said it, so thank you. Lastly, I'm going to pass on to my colleague James, who has recently released a report looking at some of the analogies and lessons that have been learned from other recent technologies that we can add to as part of RAND's work in this space.
Great, thank you, Austin, and thank you, everyone. Thank you also for the other panelists for the provocations so far. Certainly some of the questions that Kate was asking, questions I ask myself frequently, kind of why is it all so hard, something I'd probably ask myself most days. And increasingly the question about how many hairs does a man have to lose before they're starting to go bald. I am kind of standing up here, as Austin has said, to talk a little bit, not purely as a shameless kind of narcissistic plug for my own report, but to talk a little bit about some of the kind of findings that came out in a report that RAND did release, funded by UK government, UK Ministry of Defence and Foreign Office, which kind of came out just ahead of REAIM, and we spoke about it in a panel yesterday. And what that tried to do was to try and ultimately clear a lot of the ground around what the strategic level implications are of military AI. A lot of the debate is very focused at the tactical level. A lot of it focuses on the risks, not the benefits. And a lot of it really is about taken up by kind of fairly narrow use cases like use of AI in targeting, killer robots, that sort of thing. So with the report, we tried to kind of, I suppose, provide a kind of taxonomy or typology of different types of risk at different levels, how military AI might change the dynamics of strategic competition, and whether that might lead to more strategic stability or instability. And so I think when we start talking about consensus, it's very easy to think that that means a fairly utopian world of us all sitting around the campfire, holding hands, singing Kumbaya. And of course, you know, world peace would be great and all that, but that isn't the world that we live in. We obviously live in a world of competition across all fronts, obviously military, but also economic, societal competition projects soft power and to share our values around the world, be they democratic or authoritarian or other. And so really it's about how can we stabilize that competition and provide some sort of guardrails where we may be competing with other nations, even our friends, but at least we've agreed some common approaches to that competition that mitigate the risk of unintended consequences. That's a broad kind of geopolitical and geo-economic problem. It's a broad problem for military leaders around the world, but it also specifically has a lot of relevance, of course, to AI and the impact that AI has on it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about just one of the chapters in that report I've mentioned, which does look at something that people are often asked to do, which is draw analogies or lessons from how we have handled the governance of other disruptive technologies or capabilities in the past. Things like nuclear, chemical weapons, but also landmines, cluster munitions, conventional forces, you know, the seas, civil aviation, space, cyber, internet, social media, etc. So I'm conscious we've had historians, kind of lawyers, philosophers, etc. so far. I'll say I'm coming this as a historian, so I have almost no useful skills, and certainly not very employable skills. But what we're going to try and briefly do is draw out some of the key insights. I think crucially, the first thing to say up front is that analogies are a heuristic that humans very frequently fall back upon, but they can very obviously lead to kind of simplistic thinking, where we try and say, oh, A is like B. And of course, there are huge differences between A and B, and there are huge differences between artificial intelligence and many of the other technologies or military capabilities that we have sought to govern at either a unilateral, regional, or global level in the past. Clearly, AI is very different. You know, we're talking about an enabling set of kind of general purpose, dual use technologies. You know, we're talking about something more akin to electricity or the combustion engine rather than, say, a nuclear weapon. It's software driven, you know, but hardware enabled. There's a debate about democratization and proliferation versus the kind of potential actually for centralization of AI technology around some kind of hyperscale companies, predominantly American, some Chinese. So there are lots of differences from other technology areas. So what I'm not going to do is stand up and tell you what we need to do is what we did with nuclear or what we did with cyber or what we did with space. And indeed, all of those areas, as we've seen with the Korean Peninsula and nuclear, are themselves full of lots of examples of things not having worked quite how we wanted them to anyway. But what we can do, I think, is if we look across all of these different types of governance problem, so technology governance problem or competition governance problem, we can ask the question that this panel is looking at, which is kind of, is there value in unilateral or regional approaches versus the kind of broader global approach? And I think there are some kind of broad lessons that start to creep out of the various issues we've grappled with as a species in the past. And so I'm going to very quickly kind of rattle through those, but I'm very happy to kind of go into more specific examples of how we've handled things in certain domains or capability areas once we get into the discussion. So I think the first kind of lesson that certainly comes out is the need to create kind of robust mechanisms and fora for dialogue, even with our adversaries. So those are at kind of multiple levels. So first of all, it's a dialogue between the public and the private sector. So it's obviously great that we have a variety of different types of organization represented at this summit. But that really is crucial, particularly when it comes to AI, where there is an acute gap between the kind of competence of the private sector, who understand the technology at a deep level, but do not have either the incentives or the legitimacy that a government does to kind of regulate some of the risks. And then, of course, policymakers who have that, but they don't necessarily have the competence to understand the technology at the deep level they would like. So clearly bridging that divide is crucial at kind of domestic level. But at an international level, it's also about building, I think, more meaningful opportunities for deeper, more technically driven conversations between like-minded nations on issues like AI risk, but also benchmarks, standards, those sorts of things. There has been a proliferation of new cooperation agreements and fora and summits in the last few years around AI, REAIM being an obvious example. And there are things like the AI Partnership for Defense. Many of those, though, are ultimately for unclassified kind of policy level talks, which are important, but aren't all of what you need to do. And so I think we also need to get into a space where we can be having, particularly around military AI, more sharing of kind of classified information and intelligence, and then technical data, so that we can have a really robust conversation about, like, what do the capabilities actually look like? What can my military actually do and not do? What can yours do and not do? And how can we kind of figure out a common approach? Relatedly, it's about talking with your adversaries, not just people you like. And so there's I think a couple of real recurring themes that come out of the history of how we've tackled these issues in the past. The first is about dealing with the kind of longer term issue of dialogue with those actors. And you can look at, say, the US and the Soviet Union talking to each other in the 1950s and the 1960s around nuclear. And they did so with a variety of track 1, track 1.5, and track 2 dialogues to try and build some level of common understanding, even though at this point in history they pretty much hated each other. So they recognized that there was value in building that mutual understanding of what some of the risks were, so that they could then have the basis for a conversation at a later date around things like arms control and the like. At the same time, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which catalyzed a lot of that kind of decade of talk into some more concrete action out of a kind of mutual fear, also exposed the need for mechanisms for dealing with crises or incident response. So having hotlines, having good military to military relations, having fora in which you can deal with and report incidents you don't like and talk through your feelings is actually proven quite useful even for superpowers. It's not just marriage counseling. And we've seen that, for example, with, again, the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War with their maritime incidents system and kind of governance they set up. So that if, you know, a Russian ship and an American ship get too close to each other and there's some sort of an issue, they have a formal mechanism by which they can meet and say, hey, that was unsafe. We both said some things, we maybe don't mean them. Let's not start World War III. So having those in place is crucial. I think relatedly then is a point about developing models, war games, research, etc., to help understand and prioritize the risks or potential interventions that those sorts of fora and dialogues then discuss. So again, going back to, say, the 1950s, 1960s, it wasn't just that you had Americans and Soviets talking to each other. You also had lots of work going on both sides of that Iron Curtain on things like game theory, on things like modeling, on things like gaming, to try and basically create the theoretical groundwork for the more practical discussions about how we then fix those problems. So that's the sort of thing that there are lots of good organizations around the world currently working on these issues for military AI now, but probably ultimately not necessarily with the scale, urgency, or government funding that they perhaps could benefit from. Relatedly then, it's about promoting kind of responsible behaviors and trying to understand what those look like. So I think, you know, in many of the technologies that I've alluded to that we've grappled with in the past, we've obviously been trying to actually control a hardware, physical technology and its spread or its use. Clearly, that's not really what we're talking about with most applications of military AI. And we certainly don't want to shut down the broader social and economic benefits that come from developing AI at pace. There are huge opportunity costs from going too slow and not capturing the public health benefits, the GDP growth, all of these sorts of things around AI. So we need to strike that balance. But what we can do is we can try and focus in the military domain on what are the specific applications or use cases that we think are most problematic. And in this regard, there's sort of two different ways you can grapple with it. There's obviously the legal and ethical dimension of what is good or bad, or what do we not like or like. But there's also the kind of realpolitik question of what is going to be most risky from a strategic stability escalation dynamic perspective. And those two things can be handled kind of in parallel separately, because they both, I think, ultimately have moral worth. But there are things that you can be doing actively to shape norms, even in the absence of a global agreement yet on what those norms are. So at the unilateral level or a regional level, we can be doing things like establishing our own codes of conduct. We can be doing things like unilaterally publishing policies, doctrines, reporting regimes, the benchmarks we're using, how we're doing our red teaming, et cetera, to provide transparency, and also ultimately to try and effectively embarrass other countries into doing the same. And similarly, we can, I think, start thinking about things like self-restraint. And there's the work I've been doing with the UK government over the last kind of 12 months around this topic. There's been a whole load of different kind of conferences and meetings and workshops going into that. Some of the really interesting discussions have been around things like, how do we, in a crisis, maybe exercise certain restraints around our own use of autonomous systems or unmanned systems because we are uncertain about the escalation dynamics. For example, might there be a standoff between two nations where we might actually want to send a plane with a pilot in it rather than a drone into a certain situation because we think that will send a different signal? Are there certain situations where we actually want to not jam our enemies' drones because we want to at least give them the option of having reach back to a human remote pilot rather than reverting to a more fully autonomous mode? There are things like that that we could start thinking about in more practical, tactical detail about how we kind of reduce that escalation risk in a crisis. The next kind of point really, I think, is about patience. So a lot of these things, if you look at how we've grappled with them in other domains, take time, unfortunately. And unfortunately, a recurring theme as well is that often it takes something quite catastrophically bad nearly happening before nations really kind of pull their finger out and agree on something. But nonetheless, I think you can proactively build momentum towards more ambitious and more formal agreements, or more inclusive agreements that include a larger number of countries or parties. And you can do that through things like trust and confidence building mechanisms. We saw that with nuclear in the 1950s and 60s. We've seen it around cyber, where we've slowly built up a series of kind of unilateral and then minilateral and increasingly formalized approaches. There are absolutely things that countries can be doing to do that and to build trust, which provides you the basis for more formalized agreements in the future if you want to. At the same time, if we are going to move to any sort of kind of formalized agreements one day, we are going to need to investigate, develop, and roll out verification mechanisms. Now, and this is inherently tricky for a variety of technical reasons around AI systems, but they're nonetheless things that we can do. And in some ways, they are an extension of the work that's already going on lots of things that, for example, Neetu talked about around standards, reporting regimes, red teaming, metrics, all these sorts of things. The next point that emerges, and I'm nearly done, is to talk about recognizing the challenges of kind of dual use tech proliferation. So given the nature of this technology, and as I say, the fact that you don't want to limit it, given the opportunity costs in other areas beyond the military, there really is an emphasis on building towards more participatory approaches. So you do need to have the fora that are global and inclusive in the sense that they include, industry, academia, civil society as well. They're inclusive in the sense that they include kind of global north, global south. They're inclusive in the sense that, the Americans and the Chinese are both in the same room, these sorts of things. So there is still value. I don't think it's an either or of do you need the kind of multilateral regional approach or do you need the global approach? The answer is obviously you need both. But I think they both need to have different and quite specific and quite concrete goals. What we don't need is lots and lots of different talking shops where we all just have the same sort of conversation with the same sort of people in different configurations in different nice hotels around the world, although there are some advantages to that. What we need to do is we need to have, global fora that are about building softer norms, understanding different countries' perspectives, educating and raising awareness about issues. And then we need to have much more targeted, kind of robust discussions amongst friends or between key adversaries and competitors on specific priority areas of risk. And just to very quickly talk about the kind of pros and cons of those minilateral or regional agreements, regional fora, it can be that regional fora are where you have shared values, you do have a more similar kind of policy, legal, religious, ethical, social background. It can be where you have some existing institutions that you can insert the issue of AI into rather than creating new institutions. So, NATO, EU, African Union, ASEAN, whatever. You can piggyback on the existing mechanisms and kudos and credibility that they have. There's also actually a commercial and a market kind of integration question here. Obviously, if you're talking about the European Union, you have a single market, but even within, say, NATO, or kind of NATO-aligned countries elsewhere in the world, there are some clear commercial incentives for companies that make and sell defense or military AI products to reduce their compliance risks, as Abby was talking about earlier, by not having to try and agree to like 32 different, NATO countries' standards on things. It's so much easier if there's just one standard that you design your system against, and then you can sell it to everyone and make loads of money. The flip side, of course, is that it can be certain regions, you have flashpoints where people strongly, violently disagree about things. So I think, we are likely to see this be more successful in certain parts of the world, I think, than others. And we've seen that with the question of regional integration more generally anyway. So to conclude, there's lots to unpack. I think history tells us that there is no clear one-size-fits-all solution. And what we really need to do is to kind of triage and deconflict unilateral, bilateral, minilateral, and global efforts. And I think we need to move from probably where we are now, which is an explosion of lots of different initiatives around military AI or AI safety or other topics, to probably a slightly more consolidated and kind of action-focused subset. But very, very much looking forward to discussing this further. And with that, I will shut up.
Thanks, James. So we will now do questions and periods. So again, if you want to participate you can just ask a question normally. You can just ask a question normally, or if you want, you can come up, join the panel, take a question of your own, etc. That's totally up to you. I will say though that we are being recorded. So if that's a problem, just ask your question from your seat, and we'll go from there. To give you time to build up your courage or foolishness, depending on how you see it, I'll take the moderator privilege and ask the first question, which is, it was talked about a couple of times. I mean, Kate raised this around governance and expensive governance requirements. I guess, when we look at small to middle powers that are developing these technologies, that the climate regulations come to mind, where the larger countries that have already had the benefit or already in a market dominant position impose these restrictions. How best would each of you think we could balance between getting some action towards common sense regulation while not sort of putting our foot on the civilian or the dual use innovation space for small to medium countries? Kate, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I think a lot of what makes sense is when it comes to norms where, you want everyone to agree to sort of a set of standards to demonstrate responsible use of AI. I think it is good, to be honest, to keep them fairly high level. I know some people get frustrated by that and are like, well, what does it mean? You know, it could mean many things. But that does allow that latitude for diversity with the operationalization of the requirements. So I do think that affords smaller nations the ability to say, look, within our resourcing, this is going to be good enough. It's going to satisfy these conditions for us. And this is why, because we have this much money and we're going to do this much assurance. And then, of course, there's consequences for them potentially in utilization of that or exporting that capability. Because obviously you want economic growth in these small to middle powers in these areas. So you want them to be able to leverage the ability of using AI and then selling it to a foreign market. So on the one hand, you want to make sure they have access to the standards that international players are utilizing so that they can sell to the market. So you don't want them to be secret. But you certainly don't want it to be the case that they can't leverage AI without, you know, vast amounts of resources to do so. The other thing I think is a great equalizer is data. So the African example this morning, again, you know, part of the challenge of these LLM models, when we look at the cultural, there's an amazing linear graph that basically shows, you know, ChatGPT aligns most strongly with US culture, of course, New Zealand, Australia, the UK, and then it sort of does this like dive down through, you know, Asia and Africa and Russia and China, and it's like, wow, look at how much ChatGPT gets the cultural alignment incorrect in most of the world. So it's like, that's a lot of misalignment. So investing in regional data, because at the end of the day, a lot of the algorithms that drive AI are the same. They are sort of just math and they're sort of universal. And the outcomes of utilizing them depends on the data and the models that you train. And so the more we can facilitate investment in data that's appropriate to the context of use for AI, the more likely it is that the smaller to middle countries are going to be able to leverage, you know, publicly available GitHub, you know, repositories and other things to build AI that's suitable to their context and that asserts their sovereignty, their values, their power, their control into their region.
I think there's an opportunity for small and medium countries to exhibit leadership on these issues or play a mediating or convening role. I mean, that's something that we've seen across many of the other domains capability areas that I talked about. I mean, even in the issue of kind of nuclear, which is very much the most restricted, you know, kind of the most powerful nations by definition. If they have nuclear weapons, they are the most powerful in a military sense. Issue, that's actually one where, say, Sweden played a really crucial mediating role between the US and Soviet Union. We've seen it in space. We're you know, countries like the UK have been leading UN initiatives. And of course, we've seen it with REAIM, where you've got all of the co-hosts for this event are small and medium players. And so there is a chance to play a kind of entrepreneurial role as a small nation and actually not only exhibit influence over a key issue by playing a concerted kind of convening and mediating role, but actually also by developing a level of competence in that, you can then exert wider kind of soft power and influence. And we've seen that again, for example, with like Estonia and cyber, tiny nation, but because of its experience being on the receiving end of fairly early in the history of kind of major cyber attacks, it has positioned itself, and then that has actually turned Estonia into, you know, a digital and tech hub with broader economic benefits as well. So obviously, not every small and medium country can do that, because that's about, you know, who competes to be the top kind of few players. But whilst the private sector for AI is very much, you know, based in two large countries predominantly for now, and other countries are playing catch up, there are some genuine opportunities for smaller nations. And I'd finish off by just saying an advantage as a smaller nation is it is often a lot easier to change things within your government more quickly, because ultimately you can kind of just get 12 people in a room and sort it out, in a way that if you're, say, the US Department of Defense, US government more generally, you know, it is huge, labyrinthine and bureaucratic. And so although it has vast resources, it also has a level of inertia, a bit like an oil tanker, whereas a smaller nation can be a bit more like a speedboat if they want to and change direction policy-wise at pace.
Thanks. Nini and VS?
Yeah, so I will. So because of the dual nature of AI technologies, I think smaller nations and nations who are less developed, they should be developing AI technologies, and there needs to be continued engagement, global engagement, peer-to-peer engagement. It also calls for education and training in this aspect. If we think about standards development or for a given country, and also capacity building more domestic resources for their own economic development, their own sustainable development. And it is we don't want this AI race to be that will bring equity into the economic benefit that the AI revolution is supposed to bring. It will, when these countries develop their own capacities, it will lead to more equitable distribution of the wealth and development. And I think Kate brings this point of data, but I think it is equally important to have compute. So the government needs to invest resources in research resources where it has to incentivize, it has to put money into research, into building these types of compute, providing this compute, because currently, especially with the generative AI, the compute is concentrated with just a handful of companies. So needs to build with data, compute, and workforce development initiatives. That's all I'll say.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about capacity building, which I think Niti stole my thunder there. So, data is great, algorithms are great, but at the end of the day, AI is not inventing by itself new AI applications which are specific to the country. It's the people of that country who understand what their people need. And so we need to put in the hands of those people the skills needed so that the AI tools that are out there, the data that they need to gather for their particular national or regional problems, they need to understand the process to do that. So capacity building, I think, is a very big deal here. And I don't think also, it's really about empowerment as well. It's not just capacity building, but also empowering local entrepreneurs, for example, to have access to some amount of venture capital, rather than expecting them to build, and acquire their own large banks of GPUs, which is extremely capital intensive. Maybe they access shared GPU facilities somewhere, either regionally or through appropriate providers, through corporate social responsibility programs of some of these companies. So again, I think there are many ways to do this without huge capital investments, but I mean some investment will be needed to help all these countries do better.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I think it is one of the things. So maybe that's the compute shared facilities is how we impose standards. So there's a whole discussion there. I will open it up to the floor. Has anyone got any questions? There's one at the back. Did you want to ask her? Or do you want to come up and join? Oh, fine. All right. Just give the option.
Sure. Thank you for this panel. My name is Harry Meerveld from the Dutch Data Science Center of Excellence. Please allow me a more critical question, because I understand that a regional approach can be more easy. However, I think we agree that often in life the most easy way may not be the most responsible or ethical way in a lot of contexts. And if I may draw a parallel in leadership, if I'm a leader of a team, I can put people in my team that always will agree with me. It doesn't make me a better leader, or more importantly, it doesn't necessarily mean that our team product will be enhanced. And additionally, to this point, I have the question, I'm just curious, whether it may also be that a regional approach may, at the global level, make stuff that is already complicated more complicated. So in the VS mentioned the 40 faculty members, it can be hard, of course. But if you first let them draw coalitions and teams, then it may be even harder to get them all on the same page. So how do you approach this concern?
Well, as a person from the Netherlands, I have a friend, philosopher who's Dutch, and she taught me a lot about Dutch notions of sovereignty. She said that Dutch hospitals have sovereignty, and there's all kinds of different organizations in the Netherlands that have a great deal of autonomy over their behaviors. And I think you've got to understand what the purpose is of a regional agreement, right? It's got to have some political ambition. I don't think it's being done because it's easy at all. I mean, I didn't take that to be the fact that it was easy. I just thought that you thought it had value that made it worth progressing. But I mean, if we took a regional approach, let's say to you know, Australia and our Pacific Island nation friends and our Asian near neighbours, we have absolutely massive values diversity there. And on the GPT, you know, linear line, you know, our immediate neighbours to our north are like really, really low down on alignment with GPT. So if Australia wants to form a shared values, a framework with our near neighbours, it's probably really sensible for the purposes of having better relationships with our neighbours, but I don't think it would be easy at all. So I'm not sure if I buy the premise that it's being done because it's easier, but I do understand what you're saying in terms of we shouldn't be doing things you know, for the sake of ease. We should do things for some higher purpose that we think is important to achieve, regardless of how challenging it might be.
But that said, I don't want to leave low-hanging fruit hanging, you know, we should pluck it.
Yeah, and I think on a related point, I think some of the regional clusters can actually be the hardest, right? I mean, if we could get the US, when it comes to military AI risk specifically, if we get the US and China to agree on some sort of, you know, basic approach that de-risks that relationship, if we could get, you know, India, Pakistan, if we get NATO, Russia, and then we could get Middle Eastern countries, even if the rest of the world completely disagreed, and even if all those regional approaches were different, so like the NATO-Russia approach was different to the US-China approach, we would have probably negated like 90% of the military risk overnight. Like there is an enormous risk of, you know, Paraguay and Finland not agreeing, that leading to some sort of kind of military catastrophe. There is a like very tangible risk that the US, China disagree on something, and then in the context of a broader crisis or conflict, that AI somehow induces a level of escalation we don't want to go after. So sometimes I think it's about actually finding the hardest relationships and just kind of sitting them in a corner and getting them to sort it out. Other times, yeah, it's about getting people you do agree with to come together. And actually, that can simplify the global conversation, because then you can basically have the global conversation. But for example, NATO or the EU have basically agreed amongst themselves, right, this is our view, and here is one voice on that view. And, you know, ASEAN's done the same, the African Union, whatever. And of course, it can be that these clusters cut across different geographic continents. We've seen that with the political declaration around military AI, which came out alongside the last REAIM, which I think is like 55 countries at the moment. And that's quite a diverse set of countries from different places, but it does at least set like a baseline of, okay, we broadly agree on certain principles. Next time we have the conversation, we don't have to do that. We can talk about something more specific and tangible. So I very much take your point, and I think for me, it's not an either or. Like, you need the global conversation at the same time as the smaller conversations. It's just they all need to have very clear discussions. Final point would be to say, you know, some of that, for example, will be aligned to other clusterings. So there is a specific conversation around military AI and nuclear weapons that we need nuclear armed states to have. It's nice if other countries have opinions, but if other countries have opinions, but the ones with nuclear weapons don't share those opinions, sort of doesn't matter. So I think we just need to build on those sorts of clusterings.
Okay, thanks, James. We have hit 12 o'clock, but we could take, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I'm just letting people know in case someone has to go.
Sorry, I can shout if you want. Thank you very much to the panelists. That was really interesting, and I'm sorry if I stutter. I seem to have sat underneath a vent, and I'm very cold. So I'm Louis, a recent graduate student from Korea University. Part of the conversation was focused on about how do we explain highly technical aspects of a technology that even technical people do not fully understand the implications of. I sat here and wondered, and forgive me for this analogy, about Brexit. Brexit in the UK, for those that don't know, it resulted in the UK leaving the European Union. The benefits of that are questionable, I'll say politely. But the question came to the public in the form of a yes/no vote, right? So if we're talking at the public level, how do you explain, the intricacies of that question to the public, and it resulted in what were arguably lies, miscommunication, and the various other incidences where the message just got completely taken out of context. During, Kate, one of your particular comments, I thought about Captain America 2. I think Captain America 2, where the helicarrier's up there and it's picked its targets. And I thought, okay, that is a very tangible thing that you could show to a public and go, do you want your government to have this ability? Yes or no? And I just, I know that that's not solving anything at all, and it's just a thought. But I wondered if the panelists would care to opine on how we might approach explaining to a public that isn't technical arguably some of the most technical things that we're facing.
So there's the standard, transparency standard that IEEE's released, 7001, and it's really quite cool because it differentiates explanations for different stakeholder groups. So they divide stakeholders into expert and non-expert stakeholders, and in the non-expert stakeholders are end users of AI technologies and the public, and the expert stakeholders are regulators, incident investigators, and then lawyers that might manage legal consequences. And by setting up like different expectations for explanations, it helps us think about the appropriate explanations. And the public is likely to be more interested in the affordances of technology, their parameters of operation, rather than the intricacies of their technical function. So Google Maps is a great example, though not in Korea, obviously. But if we use Google Maps in a non-Korean context, people use it all the time, and they adjudicate its trustworthiness based on its behaviors, the way it helps them or doesn't help them, the way it doesn't work so well if there's a sudden accident or if there's some change to the conditions of traffic that Google couldn't possibly be sort of aware of in real time. We learn the affordances of the technologies, the way we communicate, appropriate use of Google Maps, if we were to do so, would be really to talk to the public around the way they interact with the technology, around its behavior and sensible use, and probably not spend a lot of time on the technical details, but would need to assure the public that appropriate levels of governance had occurred. And of course, when you do have, ways of assuring products that they get a stamp, this is certified, this is this has gone through this toolkit process, this has met this benchmark, that is going to improve trust with the public, and certain parts of the public will be interested in those measures. Sometimes we have stamps, trust marks, that's helpful for the public. In Australia, we have the ANCAP safety rating for cars. We have it out of 5 stars or 5. And these sorts of measures are helpful for the public. They really need the experts to find a way to do those, ways of communicating trustworthiness, and so the public understands their role without needing them to be technical.
So I'll just throw over to VS and Needy, but we'll just go a quick answer just because it's lunch and I don't want anyone to tell me off. And Paul Lauren's sitting there waiting to set up. So.
Yeah, so I think, Kate, one of the issues with advanced tech is it can be used in so many ways, all right? An LLM can be used in so many ways that a certification might have to be pretty narrow. So certified for this kind of use, but perhaps not certified for that kind of use. I just want to put that out there because that's going to be widely applicable to many AI techniques.
Yeah, so I will just add maybe two things. I think it brings to the point of trust. So maybe you can think in terms of medicine, or a doctor doesn't have to explain to me all the details of the procedures or why something will work, but I trust the doctor that and there are this the robotic surgeries, and doctor might be using different types to understand. X-rays, and so if you can draw that analogy, with medicine, and so there's it also puts onus on the developers, on different actors in this AI life cycle, to how so trust is something that is earned, right? So how do you trust these systems? Are there guarantees of their performance, reliability, where they will work, where they will not work? It also brings to the point of AI literacy, which is again with the Biden's executive order, there is this idea of so there's varying levels of expertise that is needed, but how these systems work, what they do, basic literacy, I think will help with some of these issues. Thanks. Thank you.
I'd like to ask everyone to join me in thanking the panel, and I'll let you go have food. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.